Good day. As I am making this program, much of the media in the West and Telegram channels, both Russian and Ukrainian, are discussing at length the results of an Ukrainian missile strike on a vocational school building in the Donbass town of Makeyevka. And there are claims that a large number of Russian troops, reservists, were housed in that particular building, and that hundreds of them have been killed. Ukraine is claiming up to 400 killed, 300 wounded, 700 in total, in other words, dead and wounded. Now, I'm not in any position, obviously, to confirm or refute any of these claims. I would say this: first of all, there is no official confirmation from the Russian side, from the Russian Ministry of Defense, that anything like this has happened at that particular vocational school. But then it must be said that there never is. Russian authorities are usually extremely careful about disclosing information about their casualties in any ongoing situation, and the same, of course, is equally true of the authorities in Ukraine. Russian telegram channels, however, are acknowledging that there was a missile strike on a building which did house Russian troops, and they are talking about large numbers of troops who were killed or wounded. Now, having said that, one particular telegram channel, the one which I consider to be the most reliable, which is Slavyangrad, is saying that the Ukrainian claims are wildly exaggerated. They claim to have seen photographs of the building, which may have housed these troops, and they're saying that the building could not have housed more than 120 troops at most, and that their best estimate is that the total number of Russian soldiers killed and wounded is about 100, between 80 and 100. And they're claiming that they are getting confirmation of these figures from what they say are reliable sources. And I think that Slavyangrad is probably right. I think there probably was a missile attack on a building which housed Russian troops, probably reservists, and I'm guessing that Slavyangrad's figures of between 80 and 100 dead and wounded, including lightly wounded, is probably roughly correct. Now, I would add one further word of caution about this. Some weeks ago, back in, I think it was November, there was intense fighting in a village called Pavlovka near the town of Vugleda, which was being stormed at that time by a Russian naval infantry or Marine brigade. And there were lots of reports again of hundreds of Russian soldiers having been killed over the course of intense fighting for that particular village. And there were reports, which I accepted at the time as probably true, that the Russians had suffered a serious defeat in Pavlovka. Well, it turned out that the figures were wildly exaggerated, though the fighting was indeed intense, and though the brigade did suffer some casualties, the numbers of people who were actually killed and wounded in that fighting was less than a tenth of some of the dramatic figures that had been claimed. So until we have a bit more precise information about what actually happened in Makeyevka, I'm not going to comment further, but I would say a few quick additional things. Firstly, whenever the Ukrainians launch strikes on particular facilities or positions in Donbass or behind Russian front lines, they always claim that whatever building they strike is in fact a military barracks or an ammunition dump. These claims are always repeated without qualification or skepticism by the Western media. The Russians, in turn, usually claim that these buildings are empty or that they are civilian, purely civilian facilities. These claims are never reported in the Western media, but they are usually reported with similar lack of skepticism on the Russian side. Every so often we get dribbles of information which appear to confirm the account of one side or the other, but always and invariably I have tended to find that Ukrainian claims to have inflicted massive casualties on the Russians with a particular missile strike or artillery strike turn out to be exaggerated, and I think that this is probably the case here. And I'm going to go for the moment with the Slavyangrad estimates, which seem to me to be methodologically sound and which they claim, and they're a reliable source, to have had confirmed to them from people who are in the know. Now, the other thing I'm going to say, and this is an important point, is that, and it relates also to many other stories about Ukrainian successes or alleged Ukrainian successes that there have been over the course of this war. Whenever the Ukrainians do achieve an actual success, whenever they do carry out a successful strike, or whenever they achieve a successful advance, always and invariably and almost immediately, there is massive discussion of this on Russian Telegram channels, which are able to confirm, usually, whether or not these Ukrainian successes are true. And I've invariably found that the Russians almost never, these Telegram channels, websites, newspapers like Redovka, they almost never, in fact, try to conceal Russian setbacks over the course of this war. In fact, I cannot recall a single instance when they have done so. And that brings me back to some of the many claims about that have been made by the Ukrainians, which have been repeated by Westerners, by Western news outlets over the course of the war. Things that Ukrainians claim to have done and which are always repeated and claimed to be true in the West, but which are not discussed or commented about by the Russians, you can usually discount. I give an example. A short time ago, about a week ago, there were all sorts of claims about Ukraine having achieved successful advances in northern Donbass against a town called Kremenaya. There were no Russian claims or discussions or reports about this, no suggestions from any Russian source that Kremenaya was in serious jeopardy. And it turned out subsequently that the Russians were correct. Had there been a Ukrainian advance on Kremenaya, and had Kremenaya been in serious jeopardy, I have no doubt at all that there would have been extensive Russian commentary about it. So there we go. So that's the totality of what I'm going to discuss about this incident in Makeyevka. We'll have to wait and see. We'll no doubt get more information, and when I do have more information about it, I will discuss it. Now, returning to the general topic of the war, a number of things I do want to say. First of all, we are now in the Russian holiday period. Russian Christmas is celebrated on January the 7th, according to the Western calendar. The Russian Orthodox Church continues to use the Julian calendar, which means that the 25th of December, according to the Russian Orthodox Church, is the 7th of January, according to the Western calendar. 7th of January is, of course, on Saturday. And the 1st of January, which is, of course, a holiday in Russia, as it is all over the world, New Year's Day, was on Sunday. So what that means is that this week that we are now going through, even though it may be a week when most of the world is opening up for business, in Russia at least, is a week of holiday. And that does again affect the extent of the news that we're going to be getting from the Russian side. It is also a time, however, this time when the Russians find themselves in a war. And by the way, most Russians for a long time have referred to what is going on in Ukraine as a war. And we hear reports that the Russian air defenses across Western Russia, and including in Moscow and St. Petersburg, are on particularly high alert because they do expect Ukraine to take some steps over the next few days to try to launch missile strikes deep into Russia, as they have done in the past. And the Russians have been providing more information about what they claim were the results of the missile and drone strikes that took place on the 31st of December, New Year's Eve, and we've also had reports from the Ukrainians. Now, these drone and missile strikes on New Year's Eve seem to have been centered around Kiev, and the Ukrainians claim that the Russians launched 20 cruise missiles over the course of that day, and 45 drones, uranium-2 drones, mostly targeted at facilities in and around Kiev. Now, the Ukrainians claim that they shot down all 45 of the uranium-2 drones. Another claim, by the way, which is reported entirely uncritically in the Western media. But they also claim that they only shot down 12 out of the 20 cruise missiles, which, if you think about it, is actually a smaller proportion of the cruise missiles than they usually claim to have shot down. They usually claim to have shot down around 80 or 90% of them. This time, they admit to having shot down only 60% of them. Now, on this topic, and briefly, I saw an article in the Guardian newspaper that claimed that the fact that the Russians launched 20 cruise missiles on New Year's Eve instead of the more typical 70 to 80 plus that they have launched on other big missile strikes is proof that the Russians are running out of cruise missiles. And the Guardian, of course, referred back to the fact that on previous occasions the Russians have indeed launched 70 to 80 cruise missiles on a particular day. And they were talking about the fact that this was the typical number of Russian cruise missile strikes when the missile campaign began in October and November. And the fact that there were only 20 missiles launched on New Year's Eve is a sign that the Russians must be running out of cruise missiles. Well, of course, this completely ignores the fact that just a few days before the missile strike on the 31st of December, on the 29th of December, the Russians launched the biggest missile strike of all, involving, allegedly, up to 124 cruise missiles, according to Ukrainian estimates. So, again, I find these claims that sometimes appear in the Western media, and from Ukraine, by the way, also, about these missile strikes, difficult to understand. I mean, presumably the editor of The Guardian would have known about the much bigger missile strike on the 29th of December. And I don't understand why they would therefore repeat a claim like the one that was made, that the fact that only 20 missiles were launched in what was clearly a sequel strike 2 days later, is any sign that Russian missile assaults are declining. And whilst I'm on this topic, today, as I'm making this program, there are multiple reports across the media again, the Telegram channels from both sides of the war, that there's been more drone strikes, uranium-2 drone strikes, and perhaps for all I know, cruise missile strikes again across Ukraine. Now, the one thing I would say is that the new year, or rather the strikes on the 31st of December, do not seem to have targeted the Ukrainian energy system. They seem to have targeted instead, or principally targeted, certain industrial facilities located around Kiev. And the Russian Ministry of Defense claims that one particular object or target of these strikes were industrial and launch facilities for long-range cruise missiles. In other words, the places, the factory and the launch points of the converted Strij jet-powered Soviet-era reconnaissance drones, which the Ukrainians have been converting into cruise missiles and launching at targets in Russia. And the Russian Defense Ministry claims that it did heavy damage to the facility that converts and builds these things, and that it also destroyed several of the launch points. Again, I've no way of knowing whether or not that is true, but that is what the Russians claim. The point is that if you accept the Russian claims, which generally on this I do, you accept the Russian claims that these were the primary targets, that they were industrial and military facilities in and around Kiev, then it is unlikely that many of the drones were launched at the center of Kiev itself, in which case there wouldn't be many drone strikes on central Kiev, because no drones were launched against central Kiev. Now, I say that because, of course, if drones were not launched against central Kiev, then it's difficult to see how the Ukrainians could have shot down many drones over central Kiev. That's one point. But the other point is that if there's few sightings of if there's few sightings of drones impacting in central Kiev, that might be the reason rather than Ukrainian success in shooting drones down. Having said that, I don't want to dispute the fact that the Ukrainians probably do shoot down a fair number, perhaps even the majority of these drones when they are launched. They are relatively slow, and they're not by any means especially stealthy, and it would not, I think, be especially difficult to shoot down at least some of them, and probably most of them, if they're being launched against heavily defended targets, though it's likely always that some at least manage to get through. If the purpose of these drones on this occasion was, however, to create decoy targets for the 20 cruise missiles that the Ukrainians say were launched at the same time, then that might, however, explain why even the Ukrainians admit that more of the cruise missiles got through this time than they generally admit to be the case. Anyway, I'm not going to get into more detail about this. It does look as if, far from what the Guardian's claiming, that the Russian missile and drone offensive is ebbing. On the contrary, the evidence of the last few days suggests that it's cranking up and that it's becoming more sophisticated in the sense that it is now coming after more and more targets. So whether, of course, it will continue that way, I don't know, but it seems to me likely. Now, whilst I'm on this subject of Russian production of drones and of ammunition, and again, I want to stress that I've seen no evidence of any overall slackening in Russian artillery strikes across the front lines. The Ukrainian intelligence chief, a man called Budanov, is saying that the Russians now typically launch 20,000 rounds of artillery a day, whereas earlier in the war they launched 60,000 rounds of artillery a day, and this proves that they're running out of shells. I have to say that this is, to my certain knowledge, wrong. I myself was at one point very uncertain as to how many rounds of artillery the Russians do launch on average on a particular day. I understand that the average number is around 20,000, though it can reach 60,000 on days of particularly intense fighting. But anyway, on the topic of whether or not the Russians are running out of ammunition and are running out of cruise missiles, I do want to just discuss briefly or mention briefly something that a person who's written to me a private email has said. I've said in the past that I've never known a situation in any war where the Russians ran out of weapons and lost the war where they had run out of weapons. Well, this commentator did point out that in his memoirs, Marshal Zhukov, who was, of course, the leading Russian general in the Second World War, said that the Soviets did suffer a shell shortage in the first year of the war, as did the Tsarist government in the first year of the First World War. But on both occasions, rapid steps were taken to sort the problem out, and within a year, the Soviet army in the Second World War and the Tsarist army in the First World War were adequately provided with shells. Well, I don't know what the facts are this time, but I've no doubt at all that the Russians are producing all the shells they need for their military, and this same person who wrote to me this particular email pointed out the way in which the Russians very carefully mathematically quantify shell use and related to production, and I've no doubt that, as this person suggested, especially given the previous history, they would not put themselves in a position where they were ever at serious risk of running out of shells. Anyway, I just wanted to clarify that because, as I said, they have experienced ammunition shortages in the past. Doesn't mean that they're experiencing them today, and there is no sign of it. And whenever they have in the past experienced ammunition shortages, they've always found ways quite rapidly to turn the problem round, and I'm sure that's the case this time too. On that topic, by the way, I should say that in all the discussions that there have been over the last few weeks, in the Collegium of the Ministry of Defense, in Putin's various comments and statements and those sort of things, there's been no hint of from the Russians that they're suffering from shortages of ammunition, shells or cruise missiles. That contrasts with what is being said about drones. There is widespread discussion and admission on the part of official Russian government sources that Russia is short of drones, particularly long-range strike drones, an area which the Russians in which they fell behind, certainly in production terms. Putin has spoken about this, and he's even set up a specific commission, government commission, headed by a deputy prime minister called Igor Belousov. He is, by the way, the person who is in overall charge of the Russian economy. So that tells you what a senior person this has been put in charge of this commission. Anyway, Belousov, has been tasked, and his committee has been tasked with increasing drone production. So I can't help but think if again, if there'd been problems with ammunition and with cruise missiles, we would know about it, just as we know about shortages of drones. The fact that we have no hint of this from any source within the Russian government, from the military, from the people on the industrial side, from anybody, suggests to me that this is not a problem, though drones apparently are. So just again, to clarify that particular point. Now, what about the situation on the battle lines? Again, there's been some suggestions, there's been reports. These are, by the way, from Ukrainian sources, that the Russians have made further advances in Zaporozhye region, closing in on a Ukrainian town called, on a town in Zaporozhye region called Guilia-Polye. I'm probably getting the pronunciation wrong. And a Ukrainian map that I've seen of the fighting in and around Bakhmut also confirms Russian advances in the area of Bakhmut, and also appears to confirm fighting in the settlement of Ivanivka, which I discussed, I think, yesterday, and which I said is an important town as it sits on as it is located close to a particular important highway used to resupply Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. It's been suggested that the information on these Ukrainian maps is actually 2 days old, and that the Russians have advanced beyond the points set out, located in these particular maps. I have no way to confirm that one way or the other. So I'm not going to go into a discussion of this, but it does seem even the Ukrainians are now admitting Russian advances in particular places. Now, I'm sure there's an awful lot more going on the battlefronts. I'm going to instead focus now on what I intend to make the main focus of this particular program, which is a very interesting interview given by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to a important television program on Russian television called The Great Game program, which is all about diplomacy and all that sort of thing. The Great Game, of course, refers back to something that happened, a geopolitical contest that happened between the British and the Russians over control of Central Asia in the second half of the 19th century. I find it paradoxical, a little strange, by the way, that there should be a Russian program called The Great Game, because there's been quite a lot of academic scholarship into the so-called Great Game fought out between the British and the Russians, supposedly in Central Asia in the 19th century. And an emerging consensus is that whilst there were certain officials on the British side in Calcutta, which is at that time the capital of British India, and in London, who did indeed believe that they were engaged in some sort of great game with the Russians in Central Asia. St. Petersburg, the Russian authorities in St. Petersburg, were barely aware of it. They were aware that there were some British spies in Central Asia, but they don't really seem to have conceived of Central Asia as some kind of battleground between themselves and the British. So the British may have been waging a great game against the Russians, but the Russians themselves seem to have barely known about it. Anyway, this program refers back, presumably, to that period of the late 19th century in Central Asia and talks about a great game. Now, the Russian Foreign Ministry has now provided us with a complete transcript of this interview, with Lavrov, and it's important and it's interesting. Doesn't tell us who the interviewers were, but I seem to recognize one of them as Dmitry Simes, who is a well-known Russian commentator. He often has written in the past for Western journals, but I'm not absolutely certain about this, and I may be wrong, so I'm not going to insist on that. But certainly, this was a discussion at a very high level indeed. And I'm not going to read out the entire transcript because doing so would take up far too much time, even for these very lengthy programs which I do. But I will touch on some of the things that Lavrov said. First of all, he laments the way in which the EU, which, as he puts it, was an association that only recently claimed strategic autonomy from the United States, in other words, has fully conformed to the West's uniform policy. And then he goes on to discuss how the historic strategic powers, big powers in the EU, in Europe, Germany and France, seem to have now lost control to a strange alliance of the Anglo-American powers, Britain and the United States, and certain East European states, primarily Poland and the Baltic states, who want to always pursue a extremely hardline policy against Russia. And he says that 4 years ago, President of France, Emmanuel Macron, spoke about the need for Europe to rely on its own forces and to have its own army. A strategic compass was created as a step to strategic autonomy. He talked about NATO being brain dead in expressing his disappointment with the processes imposed from overseas. In other words, from the United States. Now this talk is over. Mr. Macron said at one time it would be necessary to create a system of security in Europe with consideration for the interests of all countries, including Russia. But he was quickly rebuked by the junior members of the alliance. And of course, what is being referred to, what Lavrov is referring to, is Poland and the Baltic states. Everyone sees this as the normal course of events. And he says that it's quite clear that Europe's grandees, Germany and France, are lost in this situation. In other words, they've lost control of their own diplomacy. And he finds this a most bizarre situation. And I'm going to say, so do I. And then he goes on to quote Kissinger. He says that, he quotes Kissinger that gave a recent discussion of what's going on in the Ukraine war. And Lavrov says, no one paid attention to this line of Kissinger's. And then he quotes him, as the world's leaders strive to end a war in which two nuclear powers contest a conventionally armed country. And then Lavrov says, this is probably a Freudian slip, but Kissinger is a wise person and never says anything for nothing. And this is a candid statement about who is fighting whom. We are at war with the collective West, led by the United States, which is a nuclear power. These are Lavrov's words. We are at war with the collective West, led by the United States, which is a nuclear power. This war was declared years ago after the coup in Ukraine, which was orchestrated by the United States and supported by the EU. In other words, he says this is not a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is a conflict, a war between Russia and the collective West, led by the United States, and that this war has been going on in a disguised form since February 2014, when the West engineered a coup in Kiev. And then he says that no one planned to act on the Minsk agreements, as we now know for sure. Angela Merkel has confirmed this, and then he discusses some of the interactions between Merkel and Putin over the Minsk agreement. Several years ago, prior to her stepping down as Chancellor, in a conversation with President Putin, when he, for the umpteenth time, reminded her, that's to say Merkel, what was written in black and white about the importance of resolving special status issues in a direct dialogue between Kiev, Donetsk and Lugansk, Merkel said this was a case of constructive ambiguity, and the Foreign Ministry transcript puts these words of Lavrov in inverted commas, either presumably because this is a direct quote from Merkel herself. And allegedly, Russia was overseeing things in Donbass, so it was supposed to sort things out with Kiev as well. This was not an epiphany or an attempt to jump on the Russophobic train that was picking up speed. It was a deeply rooted stance. In other words, Merkel was telling Putin, ignore what's actually written in the Minsk agreement, Minsk II agreement. Admit that you control the two Donbass republics, Donetsk and Lugansk, and negotiate directly with Kiev. And this, of course, was a complete revision of the Minsk agreement. It was turning the Minsk agreement upside down, and it was something that Putin was not prepared to do. And we can guess, I think, with reasonable confidence that this must have happened sometime after Zelensky himself was elected president of Ukraine. And then Lavrov perhaps gives some indication as to when this took place. He then goes on to say experts from the Russian Presidential Executive Office and the Foreign Ministry drafted an approved text of agreements that confirmed the principled provisions of the Minsk agreements for the Normandy 4 summit held in Paris in December 2019. A ceasefire and the disengagement of forces along the entire line of contact was the number one provision. This was agreed upon by everyone. When the four leaders sat down at a table at the Élysée Palace and the parties took their seats along the perimeter, President Zelensky of Ukraine said he would not act on or sign a document on disengaging forces along the entire line of contact. The most he was willing to do was pick up 3 pilot sites and try to see if disengagement would work there. We had our suspicions right away, but we chose to clarify the reason behind the metamorphosis occurring on the way from the consensus achieved by the experts and the destruction of this consensus at the heads of state level. The Americans sent a signal that if Zelensky would disengage forces along the entire line of contact, the Russians would never give Donbass back. So it looks as if, as far as the Russians were concerned, Minsk basically died in December 2019. This is almost certainly when Merkel finally told Putin that the only way forward, as far as the Germans were concerned, was for the Russians to acknowledge that they controlled the two Donbass republics, Donetsk and Lugansk, and to negotiate directly with Kiev, and that Minsk, with its provisions, that there should be direct negotiations between the Ukrainian parties, in other words, between the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk republics and the government in Kiev, that provision in effect was dead. And over the course of the meeting in Paris, at the time of the Minsk, in the Élysée Palace, it's also clear that the Ukrainians were starting to renege with support from the Germans and the French, from the other provisions in the Minsk agreement, openly reneged from their provisions in the Minsk agreements, that they had to pull their forces back from the contact line in Donetsk. And to clarify, I strongly suspect that it was over the course of this particular meeting in Paris in December 2019 that Macron told Putin, as Putin has said, that Macron told Putin to stop worrying or stressing or talking about the Minsk agreement. What he needed to do was sit down and negotiate directly with the Ukrainians about handing Donbass back to Ukraine. So that, it seems to me, is a fair reconstruction of what probably happened, and we see how the situation essentially there completely broke down. And then he talks about considerable length about the position of the United States, and Lavrov shows in this interview a considerable knowledge of neocon thinking in the United States. And he's asked about the rules-based in international order, and this is the point that he makes. The West is covering up its views in a shroud of respect for its rule-based order. When this term came into use, I asked my Western colleagues, we were still talking back then, to give us a list of these rules. No wonder no one has ever given us any reference material that would show the specific rules or the code of conduct. The answer is simple. The rules mean that everyone must do as the United States says. These rules were best expressed in a statement made by a professor from Stanford University, who said that the United States had to be the global policeman to save the world. In many of America's doctrinal documents, Russia is referred to as an immediate threat. This is not only because we are going to attack anyone somehow, but because we challenged this rules-based international order. China is next in line. It poses the most formidable and systemic long-term challenge, and it is the only country capable of surpassing the United States in almost all areas. In terms of nuclear weapons stockpiles and the development of nuclear capabilities, Beijing will soon be on a par with Moscow and Washington. And so clearly he knows all about what the neocons are thinking. And as for the objective that the Russians have in Ukraine and the military campaign that is now being waged, Lavrov says it is to ensure that there are no threats to our security created or remaining on Ukrainian territory. Now, they say that the West did not try to urge Ukraine to engage in military action against Russia. However, I regard oppressing Russian-speaking people in Ukraine to be genuine aggression. So he goes on to say that discuss the terms of any agreements with Ukraine. If there's going to be a diplomatic settlement, he says that President Putin has said many times that we never reject any proposal to achieve diplomatic agreements. The terms on which we agreed to discuss them are well known. The fact that 4 territories belong to the Russian Federation is an indispensable condition for talks. This is not all that must, however, be discussed. The second large block of problems, in addition to the destinies of people who do not want to live under the current regime in Ukraine, is the security of the Russian Federation that has been subjected to numerous threats created on Ukrainian territory. Now, some people are saying that this is not at all the case, that these exercises in Ukraine, including in the Black Sea were military cooperation for peaceful purposes. On the contrary, the territory of Ukraine was actively developed. There were plans, we are well aware of these, to establish a naval base in the Sea of Azov. You know that at that time this was a sea of two states. The construction of an Anglo-American naval base would have radically changed the security situation. In the same way, there were plans to create a military base in the then Ukrainian Crimea before the coup and the referendum in order to neutralize our capabilities in the Black Sea. We did not launch a spontaneous, offensive or striking operations, unlike Ukraine. As a rule, Ukraine does this regardless of losses. Its main goal, and this is now he's talking about Ukrainian counteroffensives, is to produce a media effect. The West would have continued to extol endlessly its current leaders as representatives of genuine democracy. Vladimir Zelensky would be portrayed as a hero of the times, and she should have everything he wants for this reason. Yet his requests are sometimes rejected. There are smart people in the West who understand that these people and this regime should not be given some categories of arms. So he says that the Russians always think through what they do in military terms, whereas Ukraine acts sometimes, very often, it launches its offensives purely for their media effect and for their effect on the West. And he also says that there are, however, some people in the United States, in Washington, in the West, who understand how dangerous it is to give the Ukrainians all the weapons that they want. And he then discusses at some length the Patriot missile system that the United States says it's going to supply to Ukraine. And he says, we asked the Americans through the channels our embassy in Washington still has, whether a decision to transfer a Patriot battery means the presence of US experts, considering the expertise needed to use it. We were given a lengthy explanation that this was not planned because the United States didn't want to and would not fight against Russia directly. It will take several months to prepare the Patriots for action until the Ukrainian military master this technology. But then Lavrov makes clear his skepticism. However, there are dozens and maybe even hundreds of American military personnel in Ukraine, and they were in Ukraine even before the 2014 coup. CIA employees occupied at least one floor in the Ukrainian Security Service building. That's Lavrov's claim. I don't know whether it's true or not. But this is what he says was the case, even whilst President Yanukovych was still in power. Now they have a big military attaché office there. Obviously, military experts are not just visiting the Defense Ministry of Ukraine. They are giving consultative services and probably doing more than that. There is also a group of specialists that have controlled how American weapons are being used for months now. And he previously says there is some anonymous but credible evidence that American specialists were directly involved in modernizing multiple launch rocket systems to extend their range to 1,000 kilometers. Nobody hides the fact that information from military and civilian satellites belonging to US owners are actively used in real time for adjusting fire. US specialists are directly involved in targeting. So he's referring here both to the HIMARS systems and I suspect to Ukraine's use of the Strij drones. And then he also discusses some of the things that the Russians are going to do in the future. And he says, we continue our policy outlined by President Putin on the ground to strengthen our capabilities, both technologically and from the viewpoint of military personnel, who after partial mobilization have undergone serious training. A significant part of them is already there, but most are not on the front line where professionals, contract soldiers are fighting. A significant part of them, that's to say the people who've been called up recently, are in reserve. We will continue to strengthen our deployment. This decision was made in September 2022. The commander of the joint forces, he's referring now to Surovikin, was appointed. We are engaged in actions that will allow us to operate much more effectively in these territories in the very near future. That seems to point to some action from the Russians in eastern Ukraine over the next few weeks or months. And then he goes on to say, Lavrov goes on to say, we also pay attention to the pumping of Ukraine with big quantities of advanced Western weapons. I follow the discussions in our society and on your program and in other political circles and formats, including, no doubt, some of the Russian telegram channels, which I read. Russian retired military professionals say that the supply of Western weapons needs to be cut off. I mean railways, bridges, and tunnels. Bridges, the bridges across the Dnieper. Tunnels, there's said to be a big, very important railway tunnel somewhere in western Ukraine through which most of the trains with the weapons allegedly pass through. Anyway, he goes on to say, I believe this issue cannot be ignored by professionals. They have been paying attention to it for quite some time. They are responsible for taking professional decisions on the methods of obstructing and ideally blocking these supplies. One such method has been used and is still being used, which is inflicting damage on infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, that enables the supply of these weapons. I believe there are also other plans for achieving these same objectives. Now, I can't imagine that Lavrov, who is a member of Russia's Security Council, is not in some way familiar with some of the plans that the military has. He may not be a military person himself, but he must have a general picture of what Surovikin, Gerasimov, the other top military commanders are planning. And I have to say that I take all of this as confirmation that something is being prepared in eastern Ukraine with these very large forces that the Russians are gathering in eastern Ukraine following the September call-up. And the reference to tunnels and bridges looks to me like the clearest confirmation we've yet had from a senior Russian official that strikes against the Dnieper bridges, probably with hypersonic missiles, are on the agenda, or at least are being considered. And if there is indeed a big railway tunnel somewhere in western Ukraine, he's giving a warning, a hint that this is coming. Then, and this is a personal issue, he makes reference to one particular country, which is Greece, and the prospective transfer of the S-300 system by Greece to Ukraine. And he says, a concrete situation emerges when the West openly commits unlawful actions, then we ask questions. According to recent reports, Greece plans to transfer its S-300 missile systems to Ukraine, We asked our ambassador to contact the Greek Foreign Ministry and Defence Ministry and remind them that the systems in question had been transferred to Greece from Russia. You might remember that they were originally intended to be delivered to Cyprus, but the West did all it could to prevent this from happening, given the insularity of Cyprus and its not being a NATO member state. As a result, a compromise was reached that suited everyone. Greece bought this system from us. Under the contract for this deal, Greece may not transfer missiles to anyone without our approval. We have reminded the Greeks about this. They said they remembered their obligations. We are closely following things like this, all the more so as the same provisions prohibit the transfer of our weapons to anyone, and it applies to the majority of weapons in Eastern Europe. Anyway, that is a clear warning to Greece that the Russians are watching this event very carefully. If Greece breaks the agreements it reached with Russia by transferring its S-300 missile system to Ukraine, the Russians will not ignore that. They will at some point take retaliatory action against Greece. I don't know what that's going to be, but clearly they're following what Greece is going to do very carefully. There's a great deal from Lavrov about how despite Western attempts to rally the world against Russia, most of the world outside the West has refused to do so. And he has some things to say about democracy and autocracy and all of those topics, which I'm not going to discuss because, frankly, I don't consider them especially interesting. But he does, of course, finish with a warning that if there isn't an agreement, if there isn't a proper agreement, if the Ukrainians don't come to their senses, then eventually the Russians will eventually decide the issue for themselves. And he discusses at length the Istanbul negotiation, the fact that it didn't work out as expected, because Ukraine appeared to be making significant concessions and a serious attempt at the Istanbul summit in March to reach an agreement. The fact was that eventually it was the United States intervened to prevent such a negotiation happening, being completed and arriving at a deal. But he says that eventually the Russians will impose their solution, and unless the Ukrainians come to their senses, I'm confident that with our resilience, patience, and sense of purpose, we will defend the noble goals that are crucially important for our people and our country. We will do it consistently while remaining ready for an equal dialogue and agreements that will ensure a truly equitable division for Europe. So he's making it clear that the Russians will only negotiate now on their own terms. And he's also, by the way, shows some bewilderment about conflicting signals that are coming from the United States. You may remember that just a few weeks ago, there was a sort of buzz that Andrew Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, went to Kiev. There was talk that he was floating ideas for some sort of negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians, but we've heard very little about that since. But over the course of that, there was a meeting between William Burns, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Sergei Narishkin, the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, in Ankara. And this is what Lavrov has to say about that meeting. Several informal proposals for a dialogue have been made to us during this period. Each time we have agreed to meet. One of them materialized when Director of Central Intelligence Agency, William Burns, met with head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Narishkin, in Ankara. The meeting was supposed to be confidential, but every piece of information was under discussion was leaked to the public domain. Few things are kept secret these days, although we always try to keep up our end of the deal. More attempts were made to set up a meeting, which also included references to Washington-issued instructions. We never said no, but eventually these attempts tailed off. So eventually the Russians will, as I said, if there is no agreement, they will dictate terms. And Lavrov is making that absolutely clear. But he says that attempts to set up negotiations between Russia and the United States do happen from time to time, but they are never seen through. There was this meeting between Burns and Narishkin in Ankara. It seems that it was intended to be secret. Someone then leaked the fact that it was taking place, also leaked most of the discussions. Then there were proposals for more high-level meetings between US and Russian officials, but those all came to nothing. They all tailed off. And what Lavrov is saying, again, is that there's clearly some argument, there's some conflict about all of these issues in Washington. So, as an interesting interview with Lavrov, it again highlights the underlying point. The Russians see themselves now not so much as a war with Ukraine. They see themselves at war with the entire collective West, led by the United States. They've taken the view that the events in Ukraine, which they call a coup, the ones that took place in February 2014 when the Yanukovych government was overthrown, that this was in effect the start of a long wall between themselves and the collective West. Lavrov says that the big powers in Europe, Germany and France, have lost their political autonomy. They go along with everything that the United States tells them, that they are also, for some reason, extraordinarily intimidated by the Eastern European states, by the Poles and the Balts. It's something which Lavrov finds difficult to understand, but which is irrefutably true. He also seems to say that the Minsk agreement essentially died at a meeting in Paris at the Elysee Palace in December 2019, when Merkel, for the first time, made it clear that as far as she was concerned, the original Minsk agreement, which envisaged direct negotiations between the leaders of the two Donbass republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the authorities in Kiev, that really wasn't going to happen as far as Merkel was concerned. She was never going to push the Ukrainians into taking that position. She expected instead that the Russians would negotiate directly with the Ukrainians over the head of the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And the Ukrainians weren't at that meeting in Paris even prepared to withdraw their troops from the contact line, as they were required to do under the Minsk agreement. And again, the Germans and the French were not prepared to put any pressure on them to do so. I have to say that all of this points to something further, which is it doesn't seem to have occurred to Merkel and Macron at that meeting in December 2019 that if Merkel was telling the Russians that they in effect controlled the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, that in that case, from a Russian point of view, the logic of her telling things like that to the Russians meant that it might induce the Russians to simply announce the union of those two republics, annexation if you prefer, into Russia, which is presumably not what Merkel and Hollande had in mind in December 2019. But anyway, it does look as if Minsk was in effect pronounced dead at this meeting at the Elysee back in December 2019, and that everything that followed thereafter was basically shadow play, with, I suspect, the crisis that was already brewing postponed because of the effect of the pandemic. Anyway, that's some interesting historical information, but Lavrov has also given us some insight into future military developments. He says that the Russians are preparing to take some decisive action in the very near future, now that these hundreds of thousands of extra troops have been brought into the area, and he is floating for the first time that I know of an interdiction campaign by the Russians, military strikes against tunnels and bridges. I'm not sure about tunnels, but the bridges, it seems to me, presumably must refer to the bridges across the Dnieper. And I previously discussed how that might be done. And Lavrov talks about discussions with the Americans, and it's clear now that it's only the Americans that the Russians are really prepared to talk with. They consider the Europeans a complete waste, and the Ukrainians they don't take seriously anymore. But that whenever it looks as if some people in the United States, like possibly William Burns, are prepared to have some kind of discussions with them, as happened in the meeting between Burns and Narishkin in Ankara. Other people in the United States who clearly are opposed to these contacts immediately act to sabotage these discussions by leaking knowledge of that purportedly secret meeting in Ankara to the media, and that when the idea of further top-level meetings between American and Russian officials was floated, the Americans simply didn't follow through. They just didn't turn up, and the whole idea of a diplomatic compromise to end the war, which has been actively canvassed in the media and by the United States just a few weeks ago, that all seems to have run into the sand. So there we go. An interesting interview from Lavrov, one which fills up a few gaps in our knowledge about the collapse of Minsk. Maybe that's a historical thing, but it does illustrate the utter collapse in Russian confidence in the Europeans. And it also gives us some insight into what the Russians are going to do. And of course, they're making it clear, Lavrov is making it clear in this interview, that if there's going to be a negotiation, the very least that Ukraine has to concede is it's got to concede that the four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Lugansk, and of course Crimea as well, are permanently lost to Ukraine. So there we go. I hope that's been interesting. I'm going to be discussing other things that Lavrov has said in this long interview in my next video. Brian Beletic has just published a very interesting video in which he's talked about the possibility of Polish intervention in the war in Ukraine and how this might be part of an American strategy to continue the war now that Ukraine's own military is almost run down and exhausted, which is possible. Lavrov has some rather interesting points to make about that as well, and I'm going to come to that too in my next program. And of course, in my next program, I will no doubt have more information both about the Makeyevka missile strike and about the Russian drone strikes on Ukraine, and I will be providing you with updates about those. And if there's more updates on the battlefield situation, well, you'll be getting those from me too. But anyway, this is another long video. They're nearly all about an hour now. This is an hour and 10 minutes. I hope it's been useful. More from me soon. Remember, you can find all our videos, mine, Alex Christophorou's, the Durans, on our various platforms, which include Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. Links under this video. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Also links under this video. You can check out, you should consider checking out our shop, buying yourselves the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and those sort of things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. If you're still celebrating the New Year holiday, the New Year and Christmas holiday, then my best wishes to you, and my best wishes again for the new year, and more from me soon.